Good morning. It's the 14th of March, 2019, and this is Thursday, day four, the final day of my of me reading aloud the four articles that appeared in the Atlantic magazine in October of 2015. On Monday, of course, I read the article A New Window for Racial Justice by William D. Adams. On Tuesday, I read Slavery Did Not Die Honestly by David W. Blight. And yesterday, I read Freedom Still Waits, written by Sherlyn Ifill. Today, I will be reading What If Construction Hadn't Failed? This article is written by Annette Gordon-Reed. And Annette is the Charles Warren Professor of American Legal History at Harvard's Law School. She is also the co-author of the book Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, Thomas Jefferson and the Empire of Imagination. And as I said, I will be reading this article that appeared in the Atlantic magazine on October 26, 2015. What if Reconstruction hadn't failed? The pervasiveness of white supremacist ideology in academia gave license to Jim Crow efforts for decades after the Civil War. The words tragic and tragedy have long been linked to the Reconstruction era in the United States, but the reason for the association has shifted over time. In the first 50 years after the period ended, those words were most often used to lament post-Civil War attempts to change the racial balance of power in the defeated South. According to the zero-sum game white supremacists were playing, granting black citizenship, which required ending slavery, preventing discrimination based on race, and giving black males the right to vote and govern in the southern states, stripped white people of what they believed to be their God-given right to rule over black people. A whole school of literature and history sprang up to carry the message far and wide. Terrible, terrible things have been done to the good and innocent white people of the South during Reconstruction. The most known, most well-known purveyor of this notion was D.W. Griffith, whose film Birth of a Nation depicted the illiterate, uncouth, and lecherous for white women black men who had supposedly taken the reins of power in southern states during Reconstruction. The film portrayed black legislators as men with their bare feet up on their desk doing sessions, eating chicken and watermelon while taking the occasional swig of alcohol. These caricatures of black legislators told a story. Reconstruction was a folly. Black people were unfit for American citizenship, and millions of people took the message of Griffith's grotesque masterpiece to heart. Griffith's contemporaries in the American history departments echoed his sentiments, though they are generally cloaked their contempt for black people, substituting far scholarly detachment for the director's cinematic pyrotechnics on the race issue. In a most blatant use of the discipline of history for reactionary means, William A. Dunning of Columbia University created a school of historiography that seconded the notion that Reconstruction was a grievous error. Dunning and his protégés weren't alone. In an era where scientific racism and hostility toward blacks flourished openly, other historians, literary figures, and social commentators felt free to question blacks' fitness for citizenship. In this view, President Andrew Johnson did everything he could to sabotage the efforts on behalf of the formerly enslaved, and after his impeachment in the House of Representatives escaped removal from office by one vote in the Senate, was portrayed as a hero who valiantly attempted to save the country from the specter of Negro rule. The men who imposed him were considered dangerous radicals aimed at upsetting the racial hierarchy and making inferior people citizens of the United States. Andrew Johnson, who was barely educated himself, he learned to read in his late teenage years and to write just a few years later, was held up as one of the country's great presidents. The urgency to limit black advancement and create doubts about the efficacy of black citizenship was derived from a doctrine of white supremacy. Blacks of the era saw Birth of a Nation for what it was and organized protests in various venues where it was screened. But as noted, it was not the only movie's presentation of Reconstruction as a horror show that had to be confronted. The early written history of the era put the weight of academia behind crude formulations of racially based power politics, making the pronouncements of blacks' unfitness for citizenship a matter of social science and for some pure science. These writings served the late 19th century and early 20th century political and social arrangements, disenfranchisement, Jim Crow, and for extremists, lynching. Casting doubt on blacks' innate capabilities, they gave license to question whether African Americans should or could ever be successfully incorporated into the white politically. Very importantly, it was to be left to whites to decide the question when and if blacks would ever be eligible to exist with all the attributes of citizenship in the United States. Blacks resisted this idea in the streets and in scholarship. In 1935, the eminent scholar W.E.B. Du Bois produced Black Reconstruction, which offered a devastating correction to Dunning and his cohort, detailing the ways in which they had distorted the record. Other historians, most notably Eric Foner, described Du Bois's course with transformative work that made it clear that the real tragedy of Reconstruction was the determined and sustained opposition to the program that consequently kept the goals of the far-sighted men in Congress from being achieved. It was tragic that by the 1870s, white Northerners, tired of dealing with the South's racial problems and ready to move on, effectively abandoned Southern blacks to the mercies of people who had not long before thought of and treated them as chattel. Black status as outside of or somehow alien to the American Republic continued and continues today. The blacks have to fight for the rights of citizenship after the 14th Amendment purportedly made them citizens reveals the disconnect. In the end, the opportunities for blacks, the South, and the country as a whole were lost because of the resistance to and the abandonment of Reconstruction stands as one of the great tragedies of American history. The subject naturally provokes a series of what ifs. What if plans for land reform had been effectuated during that time? Doing so would have helped the freemen to become landowners, a status recognized since the country's origins as the foundation for personal independence. But black independence was exactly what white Southerners didn't want. They preferred to bring things back as close to slavery as possible, ensnaring former enslaved people and their progeny in the system of sharecropping and debt peonage that stymied the growth of black economic wealth for generations. What if black voting rights had not been cut off through the official shenanigans and outright violence? What different political course might the South have taken? Support for public education and public works would have likely have been much stronger if blacks had been active in the electorate. This in turn might have brought more sustained economic development, infrastructural improvements, and a higher standard of living to all in the region. What if American historians during the aftermath of the Reconstruction had not been white supremacists. A different type of society and a different type of education about that society would have given young blacks and whites an opportunity to learn another narrative about black people's place in America. There is little reason to doubt that if the United States had started the process of rewriting the script on race relations during the 19th century instead of delaying it to the 1950s and 1960s, many problems that have had their origins in the country's troubled racial history might be closer to resolution. As Justice Thurgood Marshall noted in 1978 in the affirmative action case, the Regents of California versus Bakke, America has been dealing with the tragedy of Reconstruction's failure and its aftermath for decades now, and it appears that the country will likely be doing so for the foreseeable future. And again, this is the article by Annette Gordon-Reed, the Charles Warren Professor of American Legal History at Harvard Law School. Um, uh, what if Reconstruction hadn't failed? Is her question? Is her article? What if it hadn't failed? But that would have required that there wasn't a pervasiveness of white supremacy ideology, not only in society as a whole, but in academia, in all, and in almost every element of life in the United States of America. Have a great day, and this has been my 4-day reading of the Atlantic looking at Reconstruction.